My brother went missing 30 years ago. I just found him in my basement. When someone you love just disappears, it messes with your entire life. For me, it was my 13-year-old brother David. I loved my older brother so much. We were living in a small farm town in the Pennsylvania countryside. At that time, we were living in one of the oldest houses in town. Our house was built sometime in the late 1700s. On the night he went missing, I remember my parents weren't home that night for whatever reason. But back in the 80s, it was considered okay to leave your kids home alone. Me and my brother were both sitting on the floor in the living room, listening to the radio broadcast. My brother asked me to fill him a glass of Hawaiian punch. After I went to the kitchen and poured him a glass, he had completely vanished from the living room. I remember that exact moment as clear as day. I thought he was playing a trick on me. I played along, but when I searched every room in that damn house, not a hair was out of place. He couldn't have gone outside because I was by the front door the whole time, and the windows were sealed shut since by the previous owner. The basement door in the living room was wide open, the only place he could have gone. When I left to fill up his drink, it was shut. I was horrified of the basement as a kid because there's no electricity down there and it literally looked like a dungeon. I yelled his name from the top of the stairs countless times, but he never answered. Even though I was 11, that basement still scared me. I remember that night, sobbing uncontrollably, and when my parents finally pulled into the driveway the next morning, I was still in tears when I told them about David. Mom and Dad checked the whole house. I then told Dad about how the basement door was wide open, and when he walked down into the basement. I remember sitting on the couch next to the basement door, hoping my dad would walk back up with David, but when Dad walked up those stairs, his face had gone completely pale. In his hands were my brother's clothes from the night before. I can't describe how horrified I was. He dropped them onto the ground and walked upstairs to where Mom was. I then got on the ground and crawled toward the clothes, exactly what my brother was wearing before he disappeared. I sorted through them. Everything he wore that night, shirt, pants, underwear, socks, everything stripped from him. I could hear my parents' voices from upstairs. My mother then came sprinting down the stairs and got on the phone with the police. My dad ran outside and into the field. When the police finally arrived, the entire police team thought he must have gone outside and got lost in the nearby forest. But I knew for a fact he was in that house. The police officers spent weeks searching the woods and fields near our house. The police checked the basement but said there was nothing. They closed the case about a half a year later. The entire town assumed it was a kidnapping. I knew it was something to do with that basement, but I could never get myself to go down there. After his disappearance, life continued for our family. We turned David's bedroom into a guest bedroom. I hated how my parents did that. It felt like they were trying to move on. I was unable to. Losing David was a huge damper over my entire family. Something that would hang over our heads our entire lives. Mom's way of coping with the grief was just erasing all memory of him. I hated her guts for that. Every time I looked at that basement door growing up, I could feel something behind it. I remember one day when I was 16, I was putting DVDs away in the living room. I was sitting a few feet away from that door, and I smelt something familiar. The smell was seeping through the cracks of the door. It was what my brother smelt like. I got up and nearly ripped that door off the hinges. I ran downstairs into the darkness. The entire room smelt like David's old bedroom. It was pitch black, but I knew he was in there. I started screaming his name. I screamed his name for hours until Dad finally came down. Dad couldn't smell it. He thought I was insane. I remember I couldn't talk for weeks after that. Nowadays, the 30-year anniversary of David's disappearance is rolling around. I can say it's been a long 30 years without him. I'm now living alone an hour or so away from my childhood town. I had to get out of there as soon as possible. When I turned 18, I started looking toward apartments in town, and by my 20th birthday, I was out the door. My parents continued to live in that house. My mom developed stage 3 breast cancer about 3 years ago and was forced into a group home closer to the hospital. My father was given the option to move with her and sell the home, but he decided to stay there and continue farming. My mother and father had a tough relationship ever since I left the house, so Dad didn't mind the quiet. Later on, my dad fell off his tractor and broke his knee, and is now unable to walk without a cane. He then moved in with Mom, then sold me the land for free, and insisted that I moved back into that house. I wanted nothing to do with that house. I had to pay taxes for that house on top of my own taxes. I then allowed tenants move in. They were a young couple, late 20s. Of course, my stubborn old man was angry with me for letting a desperate couple live in the vacant house. They've been living in that house for almost a year now, and they called me up last week complaining about a decaying smell coming from the basement. By that time, I had learned to adapt from David's death. I told them I'd check it out the next morning. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I woke up early the next morning and drove to the house. It felt odd driving back there. Those fields, it all felt so familiar. I tried not to think about how scared I was of that basement growing up. Fortunately, my dad finally added electricity down in the basement. I pulled into the driveway. They were both waiting outside for me. They said it smelt like something was rotting down there. I had everything I'd be needing: asbestos masks, medical gloves, eye protection. I worked as an air duct cleaner a few years ago, so I have some background knowledge. I walked into the house and headed for the basement door. I never seen what it actually looked like down there until now. I opened the door and could immediately smell it. Something was rotting in there. I turned on the light switch. Ahead of me was an empty room. It was small, looked to be about 15 by 10 feet big. This basement had been haunting me for all these years. Seeing it with the lights on felt off. The walls were stone, except for one. One of the walls stood out. It was wood instead of stone. The smell was clearly coming from the wood. The wood was rotting. I walked over and I thought the best idea would be just to tear the whole wall down. I started tearing pieces of rotten wood off the walls. Light started to seep into the other side. There was a secret room in the basement. I stopped, and in front of me I saw what looked like human flesh. I couldn't describe how horrified I was. I would rather go to hell than relive that terrible moment. I started smashing that wall with all the force in my body until it finally gave in. The creature in front of me, just the sight of it made me want to claw my eyes out. It was in a fetal position. The skin wasn't pale, it was white, and it looked like the flesh had been melted to the bones. The fingernails and toenails stretched halfway across the room. The worst part was that it wasn't dead. It was breathing. It was alive. "David," I said in a terrified voice. It slowly lifted its head and looked at me. The face looked completely mutated, but those eyes were my brother's eyes. It tried to speak. It tried with everything in it. That thing was my brother David. I had so many questions. How was he alive? What did he eat? How could he breathe? What the fuck happened? I kept the questions to myself. That was my brother in that basement. This whole time he's been in that fucking basement. I didn't say another word to him. I ran upstairs and out to my car. I opened up my glove box and grabbed my gun. By the time I got downstairs, David had stood up, dragging his long nails behind him. "Julian," he growled. I then shot him in the head. At the top of the stairs were the tenants questioning the gunshot. They walked down the stairs to investigate. By the time I heard them scream, I was already out the door and backing out of their driveway. I didn't shoot David because I was scared of him. I shot him because of how awful the situation was. That was 2 days ago. I've been driving ever since. The only time I stopped was to fill my gas tank. I don't know where the hell I am. Last time I checked it said I was in Kansas. I don't know what to do. Should I join Davis in the afterlife, or should I try to move on? The most sickening thing is not knowing what happened. What the fuck happened? I keep asking myself. What the hell happened? I'm a girl who doesn't exist. This is my last hope. This is my very last chance that someone, anyone, will see me. Please don't leave me alone. I thought after 8 years I would have gotten used to it. I thought after 12, I would have gotten used to it. As the years passed, I told myself over and over that this would be the year where I stopped whining. But that day where I finally accepted my fate would never come. How could it? It's hard to come to terms with not existing. So, hi. I'm an 18-year-old girl, and I have no name. Not that it would make much of a difference if I gave myself one. Nobody would ever say it. Not in reference to me, at least. The most I could do is stand around in some family's home and pretend like one of their names is my own, pretending like I can be enveloped in the solace that they share with one another. The unbreakable bonds I can never form, because for all intents and purposes, I don't exist. It took a while to come to terms with. Not that I've accepted it as permanent just yet, but I understand my predicament now far more than I ever could. I stated it simply before, and I don't mean it with the slightest exaggeration. I don't exist. The world itself denies my existence at every turn. I can't properly communicate just how much I don't want to live like this, though even if I could, it's not like anyone could listen. But I don't have a way out. I tried to put an end to things, but the world didn't let me. The gun suddenly stopped responding to my fingers. The rope untied itself from the ceiling. I've never been sick either. The world denies my existence, and so does everything living in it. So why wouldn't the smallest, most insignificant organisms do so as well? Viruses aren't exempt from the cold indifference of the world. I've heard people say that before, that the world is cold and uncaring, indifferent to their suffering, and they couldn't be more wrong. The world doesn't deny them their life. It doesn't deny them their very existence. It lets them interact with everything, with everyone. If they knew just how good they had it, they would be worshiping the universe for all the attention and care it gave to them. I still wonder how I came to be in the first place. Of course, I wasn't born like any other person. I have no parents to speak of, and if I had been born normally, I doubt I would have ended up like this. The question then becomes, what am I? The first conclusion might be that I'm a ghost, and in a metaphorical sense, sure. But that's far from the truth, since the ghosts can't see me either. I enjoyed living like this for a while. I could take whatever I wanted, live any life I wished, and the universe would bend over backwards to accommodate whatever decision I made. But there was a caveat. I could live any life I wanted, but it would have to be a life of solitude. It didn't matter how much I took, how much I gave, how much I tried to manipulate the world to put me at its core. It would simply never allow that to happen. I decided to test it out one day. I walked alongside a man in a grocery store, and I figured that even if he didn't see me, I could get his attention somehow. So I stuck my leg out to trip him, and to my surprise, it worked. I was so ecstatic that I had truly interacted with the world until he got up, complaining about careless workers. And when I looked down to where I had tripped him, there were a dozen or so soup cans spilled across the floor. I ran to catch up with him and stuck my fist out in front of his face. But it was even more severe this time. The structure of the aisle shifted so that he was still walking in it, but I was several feet away. And nobody bat an eye. To them, it had always been like this. To them, there was zero oddity in this new world, because it wasn't new. The universe itself reshifted its structure to avoid acknowledging my impact. I began to suspect that it wasn't just cold indifference, it was hatred. Of course, it would never acknowledge me enough to tell me such a thing, but I believed it nonetheless. It seemed to be going out of its way to spite me personally, to make sure I could never have a place in it. What was so wrong with me then? Was I born wrong? Was I a defect in its eyes? Was my very existence so horrific that it went out of its way to deny every aspect? I didn't want to keep living like this. I couldn't. But I couldn't put a stop to it either. I wasn't allowed to. I made one last desperate attempt. I broke into someone's house. Well, more so slipped in. But that's besides the point. I took a knife from his kitchen drawer and pulled off his blanket when he was sleeping. And I took his arm in my grasp, and I carved into it. Look at me. He woke up, looked at his arm and screamed. He slowly raised his head up, and for a second, his eyes met mine. He wasn't just looking in my direction, he was looking directly at me. And then the world flashed for a moment, and it was gone. The letters I had delicately carved in were replaced with basic vertical slashes. I remembered him yelling at his wife, who was screaming in return, both of them having no idea how the cuts manifested. I remembered looking out the window as he was wheeled away on a stretcher, the world worse off for my involvement. Maybe it did have a point then. Maybe it was right to forget me, but unfortunately, I couldn't forget myself. I remained firmly locked into my own fate, unable to change a thing besides ruining the lives of those around me. I tried to do nice things too, grabbing stuff from stores and sitting it down by the homeless, cleaning up people's houses for them. But I noticed that those changes would either get erased entirely or turned into something bad. The food would be moldy or poisoned. The cleaning would have caused structural damage to the house. So I stopped getting involved entirely. Unfortunately, this doesn't have a happy ending. I pulled away entirely, trying to not let my presence make the world a worse place. I figured that maybe if I isolated myself enough, the world would reward me for my understanding by letting me die. That was naive. It remained uncaring to my suffering, unable, or unwilling, to grant me the slightest relief. But I had long since stopped aging, so I simply sat around. I couldn't possibly describe how mind-numbingly boring the passing of time was. I sat around for thousands, millions, billions. An indescribable number of years passed me by. Each life I saw insignificant, and every planet that died barely able to make me raise an eyebrow. I was almost disappointed that I didn't suffocate when the planet I had spent my early years on finally gave out. I had done my research, and I knew the end of the universe was approaching as well, and I eagerly awaited it at every moment. Perhaps then there would be an afterlife that I could partake in. But the afterlife was only for people, though, and as far as the universe was concerned, I didn't count as a person. The only upside of this was that I could outlive the concept that had made my life agony. I was honestly looking forward to when everything gave out, and I could finally close my eyes and rest. Yet even when the universe breathed its last breath, I would remain. The universe is an odd thing. I've seen so much in my practically infinite lifetime, yet never had anyone to share it with. The universe went through a whole cycle. I don't really know how to explain it, but it seems like we're on loop, destined to repeat every single event that happens. Maybe I'm destined to break that loop. So I had an idea. The whole world ignores my existence, but I don't think it can ignore this. Every key I push is real, whether or not it wants to believe me. I expected it to shift again to ignore my inputs, but it seems like it forgot about me. Guess my laying low did have a purpose. To be honest, I'm scared. I'm scared that this last idea of mine won't work, that it'll cut me off before I can hit post. I don't want to live in a world where I don't exist anymore. Please, if you see this, talk to me. Acknowledge me. If this post actually gets out there, please don't let me forgotten. Can you hear me? When the government decided to turn our town into a reservoir, they told us it was to help generate energy. They didn't tell us what they were trying to drown. When I walked into our house, I was expecting Mom to be there with a frozen bag of peas. She knew the drill. It wasn't my first fight at Round Valley Middle School, but I knew it would be my last. By Monday, every locker, classroom, and lost pair of sweatpants would be under 200 feet of water. But Mom wasn't there. The house was quiet. "Mom," I said. It was 1 p.m., 3 hours earlier than I normally got home. Dad was usually in his office on a work call with Mom in the kitchen working on her next strange project. For the last few weeks, it had been pickling carrots. When I walked toward the kitchen, I saw a note on the counter. "Billy, went into town to finalize some things. Be home around 5. P.S. Don't let anyone inside the house, even if you know them. Love, Mom and Dad." I crumbled up the paper and threw it in the trash. Then I went to the freezer for my peas. The boy who punched me was an old friend of mine, although we hadn't been friends for a few weeks. Ever since the town decided to forego our land and turn it into a reservoir, the energy at school shifted. In a way, it felt like our lives were ending, even though the mayor said we were simply moving up the hill. Apparently, reservoirs were good for generating power and would help fund the town's longevity, blah, blah, blah. When I told Dad about that, he simply nodded, then changed the subject. "Whatever they tell you," he said, then started taping up another box. I didn't really understand it. All I did understand was that everything I ever knew would soon be gone. I opened the freezer and pulled out the peas. As I pressed them onto my face, the pain intensified. He got a really good shot on me this time. The fight happened during math class. The teacher scribbled some numbers on the board, then called on me to say what they equaled. I made up a number. 54, I said. The class laughed. My face felt hot. "No," she said. "Sometimes something will take the place of something else, like a symbol taking the place of a number. In this case, the answer is X." More laughter. "Don't worry, Billy," my old friend said, turning to face me. "The monster isn't going to feed on stupid people." When I opened my eyes again, I was on the ground, collapsed between the overturned chairs. He was underneath me, his face covered in blood. People started screaming. I didn't know what I was doing, but I felt better. Then, he managed to get a fist free and hit me in the eye. I fell back. The teacher pulled me off him. Then, an hour later, I was suspended. They didn't even bother calling my mom this time. The principal told me to walk home. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, the cold offering relief as my thoughts did the opposite. I hated being the problem child. I wished I could be more like my sister, even though I kind of hated her. Then, as if she heard me, the door opened. I turned to look. "Shouldn't you be at school?" she asked. My sister was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Bailey?" I could just make her out, my good eye decoding the shapes. "What happened to your eye?" she asked. "What happened to boarding school?" I asked, mimicking her tone. "I took the bus in," she said. "I wanted to spend one more night at the house before they drown us." I sat down at the kitchen table and took the peas off. My whole face was getting numb. Bailey sat down across from me. It was strange that she had come back. Her school was 2 hours away by bus. She wasn't supposed to be home until the holidays. "So," she said, pointing at my face, "your eye." "It was nothing," I said. "Is someone bullying you?" "No," I whined. "Just stop." She raised her hands in surrender. "Okay, fine," she said. "I'm not trying to make you upset." She looked different today. It had been the longest time we'd ever been apart. I didn't realize how much a face could change in just a few weeks. "Mom and Dad are going to be so mad that you're skipping boarding school," I said. "I got permission," she said. "My teachers thought the reservoir was a mean thing to do to our town." I shrugged, hating that I agreed with her. It wasn't fair that we had to move just because some energy company wanted to build the reservoir. Plus, this whole situation led to a bunch of silly rumors. According to the boys at my lunch table, there was some creature living in the woods, and the water was a way to wash it out. In the last few weeks, a few dogs turned up dead, along with an old woman in her home. According to some eyewitness accounts, aka drunks, different townspeople had been wandering down Main Street on the night of each attack. Apparently their mouths were covered in blood. Then, the next day, those same people would be walking around town like nothing happened. "Johnny from school said it might be a skinwalker," I said to Mom a few nights after they announced the reservoir. The three of us were around the dinner table, Bailey already off to boarding school. "That's silly," Mom said. "I think you should switch lunch tables." Dad went on to say that monsters weren't real. The dogs got attacked by a bear. The old woman fell down her stairs. The rumors were just rumors. I was thinking about those rumors as Bailey leaned forward. She brought her voice to a whisper. "Do you believe them?" she asked. "Do I believe what?" "Those rumors," she said. I shook my head. The punch must have knocked a few screws loose. "Was I saying that out loud?" I asked. Bailey shrugged. "I wouldn't call it a monster," she said, then smiled. "Maybe it's just hungry." I looked at her for a moment. She was always correcting me, like everything I said was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. It wasn't enough that she was the pretty one, too. She had bleach blonde hair, blue eyes, and freckles, while I got left with black hair and dirt eyes. Our whole lives, people would stop us on the street and say how cute she was, how she should model or date their sons. I figured I would at least get the brains, but she got that too. She excelled so much at school that the boarding school across the state reached out to us to see if Mom and Dad would send her there, free of charge. I asked if I could go too, and my parents said they could never afford that. So I was stuck at the school down the road with the peeling paint and cockroaches. "Tell me about this new school," she said. "Where is it going to be?" "Just up the hill," I said. "It's all the same, though. Same teachers, students, bullshit." Bailey smiled, then stood up. She went to the kitchen and grabbed an apple. She pulled a small knife out of the knife block and sliced off a piece. "Change can be good," she said, sliding the cut apple into her mouth. She smiled as she chewed, bits of apple flying out and onto the table. She was normally such a prim and proper eater. It was strange to see her so ravenous. Within a few seconds, she took the knife and sliced off another piece, then slid it into her nasty, apple-filled mouth. "I don't want things to change," I said. Before I knew what was happening, the apple was gone. No core, no stems. It had disappeared. "Did you eat the—" "By the way," she said, her mouth empty again, "when do our parents get home?" I paused for a moment, inspecting her. I had never done any drugs, but maybe she had started to do them. I knew it made people a little weird, and she was definitely being a little weird, if not a lot weird. "Soon," I said. "They'll be home soon." Bailey nodded, then glided the knife across her fingertips, pressing down on the skin just enough so it didn't break. It looked like she got some kind of pleasure from the pain. "Are you okay?" I asked. Bailey nodded but wouldn't look at me. She looked preoccupied by something. "There's barely any trees up the hill," she said. I kept staring at her. She pushed the blade too hard and sliced her thumb. No blood came out. "Bailey," I said, "you cut yourself." "It's not good up the hill," she whispered, shaking her head. The valley was perfect. My muscles tightened. I kept looking at her, scanning for cracks. This was Bailey. It looked like her, smiled like her, talked like her. But something was off, a cold wind coming up from the cellar. I knew I wasn't smart or good-looking or charming. But if there was anything I did have, it was intuition. I knew which crop seasons would be good or bad. I always knew when it was going to rain a few hours before. I knew if Mom or Dad were upset by something. When I felt something, it took over all of my senses. And I definitely felt something here. I stood up from the chair and took a step back. Now, Bailey's eyes locked onto me. She held the knife in her hand and stepped toward me. "You look frightened," she said. I couldn't talk. My spit dried up. "Don't be frightened," she said. "Tight muscles aren't good for meat." I covered my face as Bailey leapt toward me. Before it all went dark, I could see her features melt away, like wax dripping down a candle. Her blonde hair turned to straw grass. Her eyes twisted to something small and beady like mouse eyes. Her skin wrinkled, then glowed soft and red. She made a sound like an eagle on fire. It filled my head instantly, ravaging my thoughts. As her hands gripped my shoulders, I flew back into the wall, slamming my head on a picture frame. Her breath was hot and rancid, like summer pond scum. Then, I heard another sound. The screen door flew open. She jumped off me and I listened as her claws tapped across on hardwood. I opened my eyes. Bailey, or whatever she was gone. Mom and Dad were standing in the doorway. They ran over to me and lifted me up. Dad looked around, the color stripped from his face. Mom looked like she was going to vomit. "Was it here?" Dad asked. I still couldn't speak. "We don't need to finish packing," Mom said. "Let's just go. We can buy new things." "But, Bailey," I finally said. "We'll call her at the hotel," Dad said, then lifted me on my feet and pushed me out the door. A moment later, we were in the car. I kept looking out the window, waiting to see her again. Then, in the distance, I noticed something. In the cornfield next to our house, a few rows of crop were flattened, the stalks around them shaking. The hotel was full of people from the town, like some kind of refugee camp. I even saw my old friend who I punched. When we locked eyes, we nodded to one another, like the whole encounter had created some kind of respect between us. When the shaking in my hands finally went down, I took a shower and got ready for bed. As I laid there on the stiff motel mattress, I listened as Mom tried and failed to call Bailey's school. By the third attempt, my heart sank. Mom looked worried too. Then, miraculously, I heard her voice. "Sorry," I heard through the phone. "I was at the library. Big exam coming up." Mom continued on with the conversation, her worry melting away. Meanwhile, Dad came over and sat on the bed next to me. He put his hand on my knee and looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, then shook my head. "Sure," I said. "Maybe. I don't know." "Maybe is good," he said. As Mom went on asking her standard check-in questions, I could hear Dad's breathing pick up. He was normally a rock. Now, he looked like a scared child. I looked up at him. "What was that thing?" I whispered. Dad looked at me, then shook his head. "Just get some rest," he said. "The waters will be here soon." We were driving cross-country when we entered a tunnel. Do not try to find it. My wife Mia and I were driving cross-country. It was our first attempt at the Great American Road Trip. Mia and I rented a small RV, more of a camper than a full-blown RV. We packed up a couple suitcases with plenty of room for any souvenirs, and we hit the dusty trail. We started our journey on the Mother Road, Route 66, driving south from Chicago until we connected to I-70 and shot straight west through Missouri. The goal was to see those parts of the country we had never seen before, stopping anywhere that seemed interesting. From the plains of Kansas up through the Badlands of Wyoming and South Dakota. In Missouri, we saw the world's largest cap gun. In Kansas, we visited the Evel Knievel Museum and the world's largest belt buckle. We love all those kitschy tourist trap places. Eventually, we made it to Colorado, and after a few hours more of driving through amber waves of grain, we saw them, the Rocky Mountains. We made an exit and headed north through the winding mountain highways. The Rockies were gorgeous. Snow capped in the middle of summer, some of the peaks pierced through the white fluffy clouds. We saw a sign that read, "Traffic Tunnel, 3 miles." A little further, and sure enough, there it was. A large tunnel bored directly through the mountain in front of us. A large sign read, "Pike Tunnel, longest traffic tunnel in the nation. Please turn your headlights on now." "How long is it?" asked Mia. "That's what she said," I quipped. But she was right. There was no information beyond the detail that this was the longest tunnel in the nation. "Can't be more than a mile or two," I said as I watched the little white car ahead of us slip into the darkness. A moment later, we joined it. The tunnel was lit by fluorescence that gave everything a greenish-yellow tinge. On the left-hand side was a raised walkway behind a railing for maintenance access. Initially, I was struck by the incredible amount of work that went into the construction of this man-made marvel. "We're under 1 million tons of Rocky Mountain right now," I said. "How many years before this caves in?" Mia responded. I shot her a look. "Let's save the cave-in talk until we're out on the other side." "I'm just saying, nature will take this back eventually," she continued. I scanned the empty road ahead of us. "Where did the other car go?" I asked. We were now alone in the tunnel. No cars ahead of us, nor behind us. Huh. They must have sped off ahead. Maybe they're scared of a cave-in? My Spotify playlist had stopped playing. Mia looked at the phone. No cell service. She turned on the radio and spun the dial, only to find static. "You're not going to be able to pick up a station in here," I said. She turned the volume down. "Just wanted to check. If only we had some CDs. This tunnel really keeps going." "I would have thought we'd be through it by now," I replied. I looked at the RV's odometer, 45,600 miles. I picked up speed. I wanted to try and catch up to the little white car. Up until this point, the tunnel was a straight shot, but now the tunnel started to curve to the right. It may have been my imagination, but it also felt as though we were descending. Mia felt it too, and she started to get antsy. "Where did that other car go? How long is this tunnel?" There was an urgency in her voice. I was getting nervous. Claustrophobia was not usually a problem for me, but when I looked down at the odometer and I saw that it had gone up by 3 miles, my mind began to wander to unsettling places. We were descending in altitude. I could feel it. I could see a slope in the lights on the ceiling and the railing of the maintenance walkway. I could feel a pressure in my head, and I was getting cold. "Could you grab me a Coke from the back, Mia?" I couldn't have Mia getting anxious. That would only start a chain reaction and make me freak out, which would then make her freak out. She unbuckled and ducked into the back of the RV to where we had a cooler stocked with drinks and food. Just as she stepped into the back, I saw something. There, standing on the side of the road, was a man wearing a reflective safety vest and a hard hat. He was waving to me as I passed him by. Something about him looked strange. I watched him in the side view mirror as we passed, and he was still watching the RV, still waving at the back of our vehicle as he faded into the distance. Mia reappeared from the back of the RV, Coke in hand. She popped it and handed it to me. "You look worried." "I'm fine," I smiled and took a sip of the Coke. "Eric, slow down." I slammed on the brakes as I saw what made Mia scream. In the road in front of us was a roadblock. 2 reflective traffic sawhorses blocked both lanes of the tunnel. Beyond the roadblock, the lights of the tunnel were dark. There was nothing but a void of blackness. Standing in front of the roadblock was another man wearing a reflective vest and a hard hat, only this time his hard hat had a light on top which obscured his face. We came to a jolting stop. I turned to Mia. "Are you okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she replied. "It's a cave-in, isn't it?" "God, I hope not." I rolled down the window, leaned out, and yelled to the man in the hard hat. "Hey, what's going on?" The man was about 5 yards away. He took 2 steps towards us and then raised a hand to his mouth and yelled, "Just doing some maintenance." "How long is it going to take?" I yelled back. The man made a hand gesture as if he didn't hear me. "How long is it going to take?" I called again. He made the same gesture. I unbuckled my seatbelt and grabbed the door release. "What are you doing?" Mia asked. "I gotta know what's going on." "Eric, just stay here. It might not be safe." "I'll be just a second," I said. I pushed the door open and stepped down from the RV. "Stay in your vehicle," the man yelled. He took a couple steps towards me with his hand out, telling me to stop. "What's the holdup?" I shouted. The man was a bit closer now, but I still couldn't see his face through the shining light on his helmet. "Please stay in your vehicle," he shouted. There was something off about him. Then I heard it. Eeeeeee! A scream, or something, rolled from deep in the tunnel. The worker turned and looked into the darkness. Then he ran past the barricades, and soon all we could see of him was the light on his helmet. The light disappeared a moment later. "What the hell was that? Is someone hurt?" Mia asked. "I have no idea," I said. "Should we do something?" Mia asked. I just sat there and watched the pitch-black tunnel in front of me. I had no idea what to tell her. I checked the side view mirrors. There was still nobody behind us. "Where are the other cars?" I asked. "They must have gotten through before the roadblock. Or maybe they caused the roadblock," Mia replied. I saw another worker a little ways back. We could try to go back and talk to him. We'd be going straight into any oncoming cars. "There's a maintenance walkway. We didn't pass him that long ago. We can probably catch him on foot. Maybe we should just wait for the guy to come back." She reached over and grabbed my arm. I squeezed her hand. She was right. I looked out at the tunnel ahead of us. I turned on the RV's high beams, but all I could see beyond the roadblock was more tunnel and more road. I checked my phone. Unsurprisingly, there was no service still. We waited, but the man never came back. "It's been 20 minutes, Mia said. "How come there hasn't been another car behind us?" I was having the same thought. I rolled down my window and stuck my head out. I looked back at the road behind us. It went back about 200 yards before curving out of sight. There was no sign of that first worker I saw on the maintenance walkway. I looked at the roadblock ahead of us and clicked on the RV's high beams. There was nothing beyond the roadblock but more tunnel. It didn't look like it was under construction, just very dark. "I think we should keep going," I said. "What about the roadblock?" "We'll move those sawhorses out of the way and just drive past," I said as I opened my door. Mia looked at me. Then she cast her eyes to the dark tunnel ahead of us. I knew she was processing the same limited options that I was. Driving backwards would be a huge risk in the instance of another car finally coming along. Getting out and walking would take God knows how long. We could have driven 10 miles at this point. Forward was our best option. "Let's do it," Mia said. We jumped out and quickly pulled the two sawhorses out of the right lane. I pulled the RV up past the barriers, then we jumped out again and put the sawhorses back where they were. We didn't need another car to come barreling through. We were finally moving again, slowly. It was pitch black save for the high beams of the RV. We crept forward at around 15 miles per hour. As the tunnel turned and twisted, my eyes started to play tricks on me. I kept seeing shapes at the furthest point of the tunnel. I kept seeing something standing just at the end of the next bend, but as we rolled forward, there was nothing there. "Where are the workers?" Mia asked. "I don't know." I was done rationalizing. This was all wrong. Traffic tunnels are never this long. My mind started to wander to all the road trip urban legends I'd read about. The killer in the back seat, the disappearing gas station, the pale man in the cornfield. Did we stumble into some strange outlier location, an in-between point on the endless roads that cross this country? Then I saw it. It was the woman, or whatever it was, that stared back at me through the skylight on the roof of the RV. "Oh my God," Mia squeaked. I could see now that the pale-faced woman was tall, a few inches taller than the mannequins. As I pointed, she stared back at me with that terrible grin. "What do we do?" Mia whispered. I raised the flashlight and pointed it right at the pale-faced woman. I thought maybe this would scare her off. I was wrong. The light only made her appear more unsettling as she stared back, unflinchingly. "What do you want?" I yelled. She only stared back at me. She was as still as the mannequins. "We have to keep going," I whispered. Mia didn't respond. Her body was tense as she held on to me. "We've come this far. We can't turn back again," I continued. I pulled Mia's hand, and we continued on our way through the mannequins, keeping the distance between us and her as wide as possible. As we moved past, she kept watching us. Though her movements were imperceptible to us, her eyes never left us. Like one of those portraits whose eyes appear to watch you no matter where you stand. Finally, we got far enough that she was out of sight. But the thought of her being somewhere behind us only unsettled me further, and I quickened our pace. As the hours wore on, there was no sign of the pale-faced woman, and the crowd of mannequins began to thin out. They still populated the tunnel from one end to the other, but there was more space between them, allowing Mia and I to walk more freely. The mannequins on the maintenance walkway on the side of the tunnel seemed to thin out as well, and I decided it would give us a better vantage if we were walking up there. I helped Mia climb up the railing that bordered the walkway. Then I climbed up behind her. The walkway was elevated 3 or 4 feet above the roadway. We could easily see over the heads of the mannequins in both directions. There was, of course, no end to the tunnel in sight. We kept walking. The mannequins continued to thin out, but they were different now. There were mannequins dressed as maintenance workers again, but also mannequins dressed as families and businessmen. There was even a group of mannequin nuns standing in a single file line, heads bowed in prayer. Needless to say, we passed none of this on the way into the tunnel. I was feeling very hopeless that we were going to be able to find our way out. I was far beyond speculating how this was at all possible. It's not possible. And even if it were, there is no good reason for someone to do this to us. The only explanation was the supernatural. Then I saw her. Rather, I saw them. Arranged in the middle of the tunnel was a circle of mannequins with long black hair and tattered cloth. They looked exactly like the pale-faced woman, minus any facial features. I kept a close watch on them as we passed to make sure they didn't start following us. "A door!" Mia shouted. Mia pointed a few paces ahead of her. There was a door leading into the wall of the tunnel. We ran towards it. Mia grabbed the handle, turned it, and pulled. It was heavy, and Mia had to brace her foot on the wall to get it moving. The metal door groaned as if it hadn't been opened in years. Finally, it was open enough to see past. It was a hallway. It went out about 5 yards, then turned right at a 90-degree angle. The strangest part was the design of the hallway. It wasn't cement or pavement like the tunnel. The walls were wood paneled and the floor was covered in a thick carpet, like a house from the 1970s. "I say we see where this takes us," Mia said. There was no reason to disagree, but I wasn't going to get us trapped in there. I opened up my backpack and took out a water bottle. I opened it and handed it to Mia. She drank half, then I drank the other half. I slowly closed the door, shoving the empty water bottle in the crack to keep it from closing all the way. I turned to Mia. "Okay, let's go." We slowly made our way down the quiet hallway. We got down to where the hallway cornered to the right, and that's when we heard it. Ka-chunk! I whipped around. The door had closed behind us. I ran back to it and tried to push it open, but it was no use. There was no way it closed on its own. Someone had to have removed the water bottle. Our path had been chosen for us. There was no turning back. We continued down the hallway. We turned right. The hallway continued, then turned right again. That should have led us right back to the tunnel, but it didn't. This part of the hallway went on far longer than was possible without running into the tunnel. Then it turned right again. It went on like this. Sometimes a section of the hallway was 20 feet long, sometimes it was 20 yards long, sometimes it was 3 feet long, but it always turned to the right. At first it was a relief to be somewhere other than the cold, dark tunnel. But the hallway very quickly became claustrophobic, and before too long, I heard someone walking behind us. We had stopped to take a break, and I heard a third pair of footsteps on the carpet coming from behind us. I backtracked to the last corner. I was terrified as I slowly peeked around the corner, tense and waiting to see the vacuous eyes and inky black hair of the pale-faced woman. But there was nothing there. I wasn't about to backtrack any further. "There was no one there," I whispered. Mia slumped against the wall and slid down to the carpet. "I think I need to rest," she said. I put my backpack down on the ground for Mia to use as a pillow. She laid her head down and was passed out in seconds. I had no idea how long we had been walking at this point. I stood leaning against the wall. My body was telling me to rest, but I couldn't risk falling asleep. I had to keep watch. I knew she was following us. I took in the details of the hallway for the first time. The carpet was a dull brown and the walls a cheap wood paneling. The hanging lighting fixtures were shaded by stained glass, something you might see in an old diner. Who built this place? Did someone pick out the carpet and the lighting fixtures? Did a team of workers blast these tunnels into the earth? Or has this place always existed? Was this purgatory? I began to feel dizzy. I was panicking. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I slumped to the floor and tried to slow my breathing. I closed my eyes. I shot up in a panic. I had fallen asleep while I was meant to be keeping watch. I snapped to my feet and looked around. Mia was still asleep on my backpack. Then I noticed that the hallway had changed. A few paces away there was now a plain wooden door in the wall. I slowly approached it. I put my ear to the door and I could hear what sounded like TV static and the low murmur of voices. I discreetly grabbed the door handle and turned it slowly. I felt the latch bolt clear and I carefully cracked the door just enough to peek inside. It was dark, so it took a second for me to register what I was seeing. I saw a small boardroom. A long table in the center was surrounded by seated men in suits. At the end of the table stood another man next to an old CRT TV that was playing static. This was the only source of light in the room, and all the men around the table were turned towards the TV. Suddenly the screen flickered from static to a solid dark background, and some warped New Age style music began playing. Then the words appeared on the screen that terrified me like nothing else before. In plain text, the words read, "You will lose her." I froze as I knew these words were meant for me. I watched with terror as the men seated around the table slowly turned toward me in unison. They were mannequins. The TV screen then clicked off and they continued staring at me as I could barely make out their forms through the near-pitch darkness. I quickly pulled the door shut and whipped around to look at Mia. I had a horrible feeling of dread that when I turned around she would be gone, like the message on the TV promised. "Eric, what are you doing?" Mia was leaning up and staring at me. Thank God. There was Mia, right where I left her. I pointed at the door and said, "This door appeared and I—" "What door?" she interrupted. I turned and sure enough the door was now gone. I explained what happened to her, but I left out the message that appeared on the screen. "You will lose her." Those words still burned in my brain. I tried to force them out. We drank water, ate granola, and then got moving again. Hallways, endless hallways. After a couple hours of walking, we started to hear music. There were small speakers in the corners of the ceiling. I recognized it as the same New Age music that played on the TV in the boardroom. The melody drilled into our minds. Combined with the dull aesthetics of the quiet hallways and the endless right turns, the music had a hypnotizing effect. The lengths of the halls became more uniform. That is to say, the straight section of hallway was about 7 paces, then a right turn, then 7 paces and a right turn. "I think we're walking in circles, or a square," Mia said. I looked at her and took out a bottle of water. I peeled off the plastic label and dropped it on the floor. Then we kept walking. 7 paces, right turn. 7 paces, right turn. 7 paces, right turn. And there it was. Mia was right. The label from my water bottle lay in the middle of the hallway. Somehow we had been led into a loop. I lost it. "Fuck!" I kicked the wall repeatedly and screamed. Mia just leaned her back against the wall. This was our dynamic. If one of us lost it, the other became zen and thought of a solution. More often than not, I was the one to lose it. I finally stopped freaking out. "There has to be a way out. A door," Mia said. "We would have seen it," I replied. "A hidden door," she said. She turned around and ran her hands along the cracks of the wood paneling. "Most likely on the outer wall," she said. She beat her fist on the wall, listening for a change in the sound. I exhaled heavily, sweating and tired, and I started searching the wall as well. We checked the whole first wall, nothing. We checked the second wall, nothing. The third, nothing. The final wall, nothing. I gave up and slumped on the floor. Mia immediately went over to the other side of the hall and started checking the inner wall. "What are you doing? I thought you said it would be on the outer wall," I asked. Then we heard it. Mia beat the wall, and instead of the dead thud, we heard a resonate boom. A door. I shot up and started tapping the wall with Mia until we found where the door ended. It was the width of about 4 wooden panels. I lined myself up in the center, lowered my shoulder and pushed. It moved. It barely moved, but it was enough to confirm this actually was a door. I recentered and tried again, lowering my center of gravity. I pushed as hard as I could. The door pushed inward about 3 inches, then Mia joined in. We slowly moved the door, 5 inches, then 10, then 15, then 20. Then Mia slipped inside. I had a moment of panic as she disappeared into the darkness, and those haunting words came back into my mind. "You will lose her." I darted past the doorway, falling through the threshold and hitting the concrete floor. I looked up and there was Mia, thank God. I promised myself I'd never let her out of my sight again. "The exit," Mia said. She looked and sounded as if she were 1,000 miles away. I got to my feet and followed her gaze. What I saw nearly brought me to tears. We were back in the tunnel, but there was light. About a mile down was the mouth of the tunnel, and daylight pouring in. Beautiful daylight. I grabbed Mia tight and kissed her. "Thank God," she cried. We started moving. Nothing was going to slow us down this time. We sped up into a run down the maintenance walkway towards that beautiful sunlight. As we approached, something else came into view. Parked in the middle of the roadway was a large vehicle. It couldn't be. It was. Our RV sat in the road waiting for us. We ran all the way to it, pulled open the passenger side door and climbed in. There were no mannequins to be seen. I fell into the driver's seat and Mia handed me the keys. I turned over the engine, the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I shifted into gear and floored it towards the sunlight. As we got closer, I could see the green of trees and the blue of the sky. We were maybe 100 yards away. I turned to Mia, tears in my eyes. And what I saw turned my blood to ice. Just beyond Mia's window, that horrifying pale face grinned at me. The pale-faced woman was somehow floating outside of the RV. Before I could say anything, her hand smashed through the window and gripped Mia by the throat. Then, in one horrible motion, the thing pulled Mia screaming through the window and disappeared. I slammed on the brakes just as the RV passed through the exit of the tunnel and sunlight flooded the cab of the RV. I threw it in park and shot out of the door screaming, "Mia! Mia!" I screamed over and over. I rounded the front of the RV and looked back at the tunnel. And what I saw shattered my mind. The tunnel was gone. There was only open road. I had lost her. The inexplicable case of John Doe. I'm a coroner. I've only had one strange encounter in my career, but it still keeps me up at night. I don't get freaked out by much. I'm not a squeamish person, nor a superstitious one. You can't be in my line of work. But I can't explain John Doe. We don't get any murders in my city. Overall, we're a pretty quiet and safe community. It's rare that a full autopsy is required, and it's more likely to be requested for unexpected deaths, medical malpractice, that kind of thing, than it is for a suspected murder. We don't have a separate medical examiner's office. I'm just in the basement of the hospital, which frankly isn't much of a hospital. It's better equipped than a typical doctor's office, but there are outpatient centers that are bigger than us if you go to a big city. If you have a complicated illness, you drive a few hours to Cleveland. However, I'm our coroner. I certify all deaths in the city and perform all our autopsies. When an unknown body turned up in the woods, you better believe the cops were all over it. It was the only exciting thing to happen to them that week. Hell, maybe ever. Several more officers than were necessary came in with the paramedics looking for some answers on how he'd gotten there. I didn't know. He didn't have any defensive wounds. There was nothing in the initial exterior examination. Livor mortis and rigor mortis were present. I estimated the death at around 12 hours prior. The x-rays came back normal. There were no obvious signs of poisoning upon interior examination. Stomach contents were a half-digested tuna sandwich and I think a Coke. His heart was enlarged, but not abnormally so. It was indicative of cardiomyopathy, but this is the United States of America. We're all fat and have heart disease. The one weird thing was that we had trouble getting prints. No matter how we took them, they just looked blurred. The police couldn't run them. But his fingertips didn't appear to be damaged in any way. To visual inspection, they appeared normal. Due to the lack of any other evidence, I would have guessed heart attack if I hadn't known the circumstances. But he was found a mile into the woods, stark naked, a few feet off the trail. The most likely cause, I felt, was poison. There weren't obvious signs, but sometimes there aren't, depending on what was used. He didn't have dirty feet. which meant he probably didn't strip naked and go for a run. He was likely placed there after death. I told the police as much. I packed his organs back into his chest cavity, his brain back in his skull, and put him away. I sent the samples to the lab for testing, but it takes a while, and the really comprehensive panels are expensive enough that the department didn't want to pay for them. I mean, you don't show up in the woods, naked, by yourself, in the middle of the night, and then die of natural causes, typically. He didn't show any obvious signs of a drug overdose. The police believed it was a homicide, but without any evidence, I ruled cause of death undetermined. We left it there, and that was the last I thought of it, until the lab called me to ask what the hell I had sent them. The lab results were inconclusive. They couldn't get any DNA from the samples at all. I went to get the body back out and take some more samples, maybe look at some new tissue slides under the microscope again. But he wasn't where I left him. I looked high and low, meaning in each cold locker, thinking I had mislabeled or misremembered where I put him, but he wasn't in any of them. It's not a large morgue. It's not like misplacing your keys. If I couldn't find the body, it was gone. I didn't like that at all. To be honest with you, I panicked. How do you lose a body? In all my years in the field, I had never heard of such a thing happening. I called up the chief of police and explained the situation. He asked some questions I wasn't sure of the answers to. Yes, I'd left my office unattended on occasion. No, I hadn't been paying close attention to whether I locked it at the end of every day. I was pretty sure I did. I do so out of habit, but I wasn't completely sure. We're a small city. Safe. Stealing human remains is outside the common way. It's not something I had considered a possibility. So the police added a report about the theft of human remains from government custody, which I'm sure if they ever caught the perpetrator would be a list of charges longer than my leg. The running theory was that someone stole the remains to cover up the murder. That didn't go over well since it implied a member of the hospital staff was likely involved. But what can you do? The police weren't too serious about pursuing it. I don't think they seriously suspected anyone at the hospital. Without an ID, it was hard to investigate. It was a decent, scary story to talk about at parties, especially since the death had been well covered by the local papers. Everyone around here had heard about it. A few months went by, and honestly, I hardly thought about it anymore, though I was careful to lock the morgue when I left for the day. We were busy. We were having an unfortunate uptick in deaths, so I had gotten the okay to hire on an assistant. He was a sharp kid. He learned quickly. He had a few autopsies under his belt when another body turned up. John Doe, clothed this time, Hanes, not so, white t-shirt, and Levi's, well-worn tennis shoes. Called in by a scared teen who found him in the dumpster behind the fast food joint where she worked. It was a different pair of cops who responded at the scene. Whole different team of people, EMTs, everybody. Which is why I guess I was the first to notice. "What the fuck?" I said when I saw his face. "What?" asked my assistant. "This is the same guy," I said. "This is the same guy that went missing before." "A missing persons case? You recognize him?" "No, I mean the same guy. The remains that went missing a few months ago. How is this possible?" My assistant didn't have any idea, but I was highly agitated and probably not making a lot of sense. I called the police department. The two cops who brought him in this time weren't particularly helpful. They started speculating that it was a serial killer with a specific type. I called back and insisted they send some more senior guys down, the ones who picked up John Doe before. So Laurent and Bill came down to take a look. "Well, I'll be goddamned," Laurent said. "It's the same fucking guy." "Couldn't be," Bill said. "A twin, maybe?" "Maybe," I agreed grudgingly. "It must be. What are the odds?" "Well, could it be the same guy?" Laurent asked. "Hear me out. What if they took the remains and froze them?" I shook my head. "I performed an autopsy last time. This guy hasn't been cut open." "You'd think if there was a pair of identical twins missing, someone would have reported it," Bill said. "I can make a few calls. Let me know if anything comes back." The weird thing, well, one of the weird things, about that body was that it was fresh. The police believed he had been in the dumpster a few hours at most, but he could have died elsewhere and been moved, and in fact that seemed likely based on the activity at the restaurant. However, he had no signs of livor mortis, which, if you don't know, is discoloration of the skin due to blood pooling. It's obvious to visual inspection. The ambient temperature was quite warm, and counterintuitively this typically accelerates the onset of rigor mortis, which you probably do know of. It begins in fine muscles of the face before affecting the hands, and then the rest of the larger muscles, making them stiff. It usually sets in about 2 hours to 8 hours post-mortem and lasts for about a day altogether. You can estimate the time since death based on how it's affecting the muscles. John Doe had no signs of rigor mortis whatsoever, nor any of the markers that come after that. In short, he was dead, but didn't display some of the typical signs of being dead, and none of the ones that would help estimate time since death. He presented, honestly, like someone who had just died on the examination table moments before. We have a set of steps we take to verify a person is actually dead. It includes an EKG. There's no way to make a mistake. The EMTs on the scene had also pronounced him dead, for what that's worth. He was dead. I felt a bit superstitious, but even so, I couldn't help but check for a pulse a few times before making an incision, just in case. I had a weird feeling like the subject wasn't dead, or, and I feel weird even saying this, but just barely dead. Only mostly dead, as they said in The Princess Bride, but I mean it in a much less charming way. Something about this body felt off. However, I'm not sure if I was just jittery due to the circumstances, and hindsight does not improve my recollection of him at all. If you're a decent coroner, you're the methodical type. I'm at least halfway decent, and wouldn't say I half-assed it the first time, but I was extremely meticulous this time. By the book. We opened him up. We examined every organ. We even cut into his limbs, which we don't normally do without specific reason. We took a lot more samples than we had the first time. His heart was strange. I weighed it, and it was enlarged. I was planning to do a couple of cross-sections to see if it was healthy, but when I pressed into it with the scalpel, a viscous white fluid oozed out. It had a smell that seeped through my mask. My assistant had to run and retch. I don't know if you've ever vomited into a face mask and shield, but it's messy. He was effectively down for the count. The smell was like walking into a Yankee Candle store, sort of. Not a bad smell per se, not like a severely decomposing body, but still strong enough to make you lightheaded. I've never seen or heard or smelled of anything like it. It was like the fluid had completely filled the atrial and ventral cavities. I would have said it was like his blood had been replaced, but when we vacuumed out his chest cavity, the blood had been normal. His arteries and veins were normal. It was only the heart. I guessed that whatever happened must have been post-mortem, or else it would have been pumped through his arteries. But that didn't explain what had happened. I briefly debated the merits of dumping the fluid down the sink, and therefore eventually into the municipal water supply, but decided against it. I put on fresh gloves and took a careful sample, being sure to seal it. I then put the whole metal tray full of the substance into one of the triple-bagged 5-gallon buckets we had handy. I tied the bags off, closed the lid, and then bagged the bucket for good measure. We left the room. I locked the door behind me, and we went upstairs to give my assistant a chance to recuperate. The ventilation down there is very good, so we hoped it would dissipate the smell in the meantime. When we finally went back into the room, the smell had mostly disappeared, along with the body. So had the samples, the bucket with the substance in it, and even the camera we had been photographing him with. We called in the police again. They added a note to their report. If you're wondering about security footage, we had very few cameras. They were limited to the public entrances at the front and back of the building and in the emergency room and main corridors on the first floor. There weren't any in the stairwells, which were on either side of the building, had emergency exit doors to the outside. Nor were there any cameras in the basement, which only held the morgue, some storage rooms, and some admin offices. I know it probably seems strange to some of you, but we're a drive-by town with no real crime, and this was years ago. Cameras weren't as ubiquitous as they are today. I heard the police complain to the mayor, but the state was also in the middle of a budget crisis at that time, so I assumed they didn't have the money to add more. So, when the body showed up the third time, about 6 months later, I was beside myself. A distressed citizen called in a report of a creepy man parked in a car just outside her family's home. When dispatch sent some police to investigate, it became obvious he was dead after they shot him. After a couple verbal warnings, the rookie officer panicked and fired. The bullet passed through his left shoulder. Word got around, the rookie was swearing up and down that he saw movement, which is clearly impossible because the man was dead. But, in fairness, most of what had occurred with this guy seemed impossible. His partner said there wasn't any movement. It was just a rookie who was trigger happy. That was the official report. But interestingly enough, off-duty and after a few beers, he confessed to Laurent, who passed it on to me, that something was not quite right about the body. He wouldn't say what. I am not sure if that's how he really felt, or if he was drunk and trying to placate Laurent, who was pissed that some white kid with a badge fired a shot at an unmoving, unresponsive person and got off with a slap on the wrist. The police didn't want word getting out about this disappearing, reappearing body. Neither did the mayor, as it wasn't good press for him. So he and the police department let our local reporters have a field day with the rookie, who ended up quitting the force and leaving town. He couldn't take the notoriety, so he left. I heard he started a landscaping business with his brother in Indiana. The third autopsy itself was mostly normal, aside from the absence of the typical stages of death, liver and/or rigor mortis, putrefaction, which I don't mean to gloss over because it is very strange, incredibly strange. It's impossible. But so is doing an autopsy on the same person 3 times. Honestly, in that situation, it was almost weirder that it was normal. When you're expecting something to jump out at you, every minute it doesn't is agonizing. He still didn't seem right to me, but we didn't find any other abnormalities. I kept slicing into him and expecting something mind-numbingly weird to happen. But there were no mysterious fluids. Nothing mysterious at all. There was the obvious entry and exit wound of the bullet, but nothing else of note, which was both not strange enough and also still strange. There still weren't any obvious causes of death. He was by every measure a perfectly healthy human male. I wondered if I had entered some sort of purgatory for mediocre medical examiners. Maybe this body was punishment for missing something, and I was doomed to repeat it until I found the cause of death. I really was questioning my career and my life choices by this point. When I went home, I started talking with my wife about moving closer to her family like she's always wanted. I don't like her family. But a fresh start in a new town seemed like a good idea. We were careful that time about chain of custody. The police department sent us a detail to guard the body, which mainly consisted of a guy in the basement of the hospital to watch the lockers after we left for the night. We did our thing and put the guy into cold storage. We shipped the samples to the big lab upstate. But of course it did have to get weird. Like with the previous bodies, no matter how carefully we took prints, the images always looked blurred when we tried to match them in the database. Same with his dental records. The DNA samples came back inconclusive. We sent them another sample. Same results. The police don't formally close investigations for at least a year, but we only have to hold unclaimed remains for 30 days. We kept some samples assuming there was going to be a protracted back and forth with the lab, but we sent him for cremation as soon as it was allowed. I wanted him out of my morgue. But you know the story by this point. A couple guys came to transport him first thing. I opened the locker to pull him out, and the body was missing. So we opened every cold locker in the storage room to make sure I hadn't misplaced him. This time we found him. I wish we hadn't. He was on top of someone else. They were lying together, like someone had placed them there in the mockery of a marriage bed. I cannot stress this enough. It was deeply disturbing, and I say this as someone who has seen some pretty gruesome deaths. First of all, the girl was underage. I mean, if you're going to pull a prank like this, I guess you could argue age doesn't really matter when you're talking about lifeless bodies. I don't know that that was the intent, but the image alone was bad. I can't forget how it looked. This middle-aged man with his arms wrapped around a blonde teenage girl. She looked like a child. She had overdosed. Not disfigured by an accident or anything like that. I don't think you could mistake her for a sleeping girl, but she looked peaceful enough. And this guy honestly did look like he was sleeping. He just didn't look dead to me. I don't know how to describe it. I've been in this line of work a long time, and I've never seen a body look like that. It looked like this grown man had crawled into bed to sleep with a dead little girl. Aside from the grotesqueness of the scene, it was a complicated pose. His arms were wrapped around her, so parts of him were under her, and parts of her were under him, if that makes sense. It would have taken significant manipulation of both bodies to get them into that position. It took me and my assistant both to get them separated. We didn't take pictures. It was probably protocol, it being a crime scene and all, but it didn't feel right. I didn't want evidence that her parents might see in some court case someday. I didn't pick up the camera and no one asked me to. Everyone was pretty rattled. The techs didn't like it. The on-duty cop didn't like it. He liked it even less when his shift commander personally drove down to the hospital to grill him and hospital security. Had he fallen asleep? Had he been skipping out? Had he left the body alone for any length of time? He swore up and down the only times he left were to take a leak. 2 minutes tops. He locked the door behind him. There was no one in the basement of the building when he usually took his bathroom break around 4 a.m. There was, of course, nothing on the cameras overnight, but as I mentioned, the emergency exit doors in the stairwells were not monitored, as they only opened from the inside. So we supposed it was in the barest realm of possibility that someone walked in the main entrance and hid out, or snuck in the side entrance one night, came downstairs to do their deed at 4 a.m., only to escape out a side door. It seemed improbable someone could move those bodies alone, and that quickly. Maybe the police officer was lying, and in on it, and even helped the perp. But that of course begs the question, to what end? For the cop, or this unknown person or people? What possible motive could there be for that? They didn't steal or destroy evidence this time. It was simply bizarre. The shift commander was frustrated, but the details didn't point to anything plausible. The police did a very thorough investigation. They swept the whole lab for prints. There was nothing unusual. All people who had been there and were supposed to have been there, and not that many prints besides, as most of the time people wear gloves. They didn't find anything on the CCTV tapes. None of the hospital staff remembered anything unusual in the past month. Anyway, the techs carted the guy off and they cremated him. There was some dithering about whether to continue to hold him in light of these new events, but I think everyone was just as eager to get rid of him as I was. So he left that morning to get cremated. I followed up with one of the guys who took him, and he swore he saw John Doe go into the chamber with his own eyes. I felt relieved. He hadn't disappeared this time. Whatever this bizarre tableau was, it was over. And yet, imagine my surprise when he showed up again. Turned up like a bad penny. I didn't even ask the circumstances. I was afraid to. I'll spare you the details of the autopsy. There was nothing noteworthy. Again, no cause of death could be determined. He went into a locker. I sent the samples to the lab even though I knew it was futile. Can you guess what happened after? Yeah. We lost the body again. Only took a couple days. This time there were eyewitnesses, though what they saw frankly raises more questions than it answers. An admin saw a guy in misfitting clothes and a lab coat limping barefoot out of the lobby. She said she called out to him a few times, but he ignored her. She knew he didn't work in the building, and of course the bare feet were suspicious. She was worried he was having some kind of psychiatric episode, so she called security and the police. He went right out the back door. You can see him on the security footage of the rear parking lot, just the grainy monochrome back of his head. John Doe shuffling away from the building. The worst part for me is the clothes he's wearing. They're mine. I kept a spare set downstairs. He went through my things and he took them before he walked off. The admin is in frame for a few seconds. She comes and stands outside, watching the man go. If you watch the tape all the way through, the cops get there, and she comes back out with security. They confer for a minute. She points them in the direction John Doe went, and they go after him. If you keep watching, a second set of cops pull up and go after the first two. And what wasn't caught on camera was the manhunt when the first two cops didn't come back. They stopped responding to their radios shortly after entering the woods near the property line, past the parking lot. The second set of officers couldn't find them. The next day they brought in some local huntsmen who are good trackers. Then they brought in dogs from a K9 unit in another town. When both of those failed, the police enlisted able-bodied volunteers to completely scrub the whole area, square foot by square foot. The manhunt lasted about a week before they gave up hope. It was a major scandal. People were speculating all sorts of crazy things. An escaped asylum patient gone on a murderous rampage in the woods, what have you. The fact that he was a dead John Doe actually managed to get swept by the wayside. He was clearly alive in the security footage. Everyone wanted to know who he was. We never figured it out. The car he was found in the previous time was registered to an elderly man a few towns over, who had died of natural causes, and the car had been reported stolen by his son, who was the executor of his estate. They denied knowing John Doe, and neither of them could be proven to have any association with him, nor did they resemble him, so the car theft didn't seem like a personal or familial dispute. The trail was cold. I'm ashamed to say I didn't join the search to find the missing officers. To be honest with you, and I feel guilty about this, I hoped they didn't find John Doe. Missing men be damned. I couldn't bear to do another autopsy on him, and resolved to quit on the spot if they found him. And lucky or unlucky, they didn't. They never found a trace of him, nor the police officers who followed him. No blood, no sign of a struggle, not even a footstep. It's been many years since then. I think he's gone for good. I don't know what John Doe wanted, but I guess he must have gotten it somehow. Or maybe he's haunting some other benighted ME's office somewhere. I'll tell you, while I like my job, and I always have, I've hated unzipping body bags since then. I'm always half afraid it will be John Doe in there, laughing at me. My retirement is coming up soon, and I'm looking forward to never having to wonder if I'll see him again. I finally met the thing in the closet. Starting from the time I was born, I grew up in a small room on the third floor of my family's country estate. In most ways, the room was ordinary, painted in a pale pink color that I loved, until I didn't, and tastefully furnished with a double bed, a white writing desk, and ample shelves to display my beloved collection of stuffed rabbits. The only unusual feature of the room was the closet. Featuring a door of glass and painted concrete, the closet was locked at all times. The door itself was large, perhaps a foot taller than a standard one and twice as wide. Though the glass looked fairly new, parts of the door looked old. Perhaps they weren't concrete at all, but rather carved stone. Inset into the rock were strange symbols that looked like arrows and birds, the line all straight, chiseled. When I asked what was inside, my father told me it contained dangerous electrical wiring that would kill me in an instant if I ever touched it. For the first few years of my life, I supposed I believed all of that, just as I believed in Santa Claus and angels and other nonsense. Then, one day when I was 4 or 5 trying to sleep at night, I heard something from the closet, a muffled cough. It almost sounded far away, though the closet was no more than 5 feet from my bed. At first I dismissed it as my imagination. Then, more certainly this time, I heard it again. 2 coughs in a row, muffled as if behind a very thick wall. My heart raced. My bladder emptied. I called for my mother as loud as I could. She and my father both ran up the stairs in an instant. Their movements were quick and methodical. My mother turned on the light, and my father edged toward the window. It was only after my eyes adjusted to the light that I realized he was carrying a gun. "Not the window," I said. "The closet." My parents exchanged a glance, and my mother gave an audible sigh of relief. "There's nothing in the closet," she said, stroking my hair. "Now let's change these sheets and pajamas and get you back to bed." As time went on, I noticed other strange things about the room. Once, when my parents refused to let me visit town for the 100th time, I angrily tossed a chair at my bedroom window, sure it would smash into a million pieces. It did not. Instead, the chair bounced harmlessly off of the glass and ended up clocking me in the face, giving me a nasty cut. Later, I looked more closely at the glass and realized it was thick. So was the glass on the windows downstairs and even the car, though we rarely travel it. In fact, it was only on rare occasions that we left the estate. Instead of school, I was treated to a series of private tutors who educated me in Latin, Greek, and mathematics. On every visit, my father searched these men thoroughly, turning out pockets and looking about their mouths with a tongue depressor and a flashlight. Once I asked my Latin tutor about the symbols on my closet. He spent a bit of time examining them, looking perplexed. "What are they?" I asked. "Hieroglyphics?" "No," he said. "I'd say cuneiform, except that I only recognize about half of the symbols. The others are different than any I've seen." "How familiar are you with cuneiform, though?" I asked. "Very." On the way out of the house that day, I saw the scholar talking with my father. My father kept his face stony but glanced at me once or twice, nodding his head. The next week, a new tutor arrived. I was allowed ample television time. I knew that my situation was different than most. Indeed, I was being treated more like a Renaissance princess than a modern-day girl. "Am I sick?" I asked my father at dinner one day when I was 9, and he and my mother exchanged a look. "Are you worried the tutors are contagious?" "Of course not," said my father. "Am I a vampire then? A witch? A monster of some sort?" "Not even a bit," said my mother, laughing a bit now. "Am I a princess?" I asked. "A countess? A lady of some sort?" My parents exchanged a look. "You are not," my father finally said. "We just want to keep you safe." Beneath the table, my fists curled into balls. "And am I meant to be kept as a prisoner forever?" I asked. I expected my father to roll his eyes, to dismiss my question as he always did. Instead, he simply said, "No," and returned to cutting his pork chop into tiny pieces. My parents were an unbreakable vault of secrets. My tutors refused to speak of anything but their assigned subjects. I had no playmates, and so I began to talk to whoever lived in my closet. I knew someone was there. "I wonder if you're a man or a woman," I began to speak into the dark one day. "Or perhaps you're not just one person. Perhaps there are many of you. Or perhaps you're not a person at all. Perhaps you're a pack of monsters trapped in there by a witch's curse. Perhaps you're a ghost haunting me." The closet did not respond, but I kept talking anyway. "It's okay if you can't say anything. I suppose we're all bound by rules of some kind. But I know you're there. I heard you cough. I think I heard a sneeze once, too. My ears are pretty good, you know. Sometimes I think I hear you breathing." I went on like that for hours, some nights, treating the thing in the closet like my personal diary. It was a good listener, after all. I suppose, over time, it became my closest friend. Then one night I woke to the sound of an explosion, followed by my mother screaming from far away. Then came the rapid staccato of gunfire and an eerie silence. I looked outside to see 3 black vans parked outside and half a dozen men pointing guns at my window. Then came the thwack of bullets against the glass. At first, they had no effect. Then the first crack formed. I was about to scream when I turned to see my closet door opening. Something big came out. It might have been a person, except that it was 3 to 4 times the size of my father. Through the dark of the room, I could tell that it was dressed in some kind of skin-tight suit all made of black scales that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The suit seemed to cover every inch, even his face. He had no hair as far as I could tell, and above his eyebrows was a ring of protrusions that might have been horns. "Get in the closet," it said, its voice lower than any man's. His hands began to tense, and his fingers seemed to lengthen into knives. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Just then, the window exploded, and quicker than I would have thought possible, the thing threw its body between me and the breaking glass. Without another word, it hoisted me into the closet as if I were a sack of flour and then slammed the door behind me. The first thing I noticed from inside the closet was that the mirror was one way. I could see out perfectly, though the glass. It occurred to me that the thing had been watching me every night of my life since I was a baby. The second thing I noticed was a man, a normal-sized man, in some kind of military uniform running up the stairs, his gun already firing. A pair of bullets caught the creature in the gut, but it barely winced. "Paz on sight. Holy fuck, I've never seen one this..." Before the man could utter another word, the thing charged at the man, swinging its long fingers, slicing him in half at the waist. The man's walkie-talkie buzzed over his corpse. "Cowboy, you still there? What age Paz we talking? What size? Cowboy?" More bullets cut through the room. The thing descended the stairs. I heard another scream. Whatever soundproofing existed in the room seemed to also work one way. Scream after scream carried their way to my ears along with bursts of gunfire. I watched bullets cut through my mattress, sending bursts of feathers into the air. I'm not sure how long it went on like that. Perhaps 10 minutes. Perhaps an hour. I shook with fear. I cried. At least I didn't wet myself this time. Then, finally, it was over. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps coming up the stairs, and the creature appeared. It held its hand to the door, which opened automatically at its touch. "More will come," he said after a few minutes. A bit of blood was dripping from his sharp teeth. I wasn't sure if it was his or someone else's. "Come." Then it reached for me, and I collapsed into its arms. The last thing I saw before I passed out were two black wings unfolding from its back. I woke the next day in a bedroom that was completely unfamiliar. Odd sculptures of men with elongated faces lined an entire wall of the room, staring at me with contorted grins. Before long, a woman I recognized as a distant aunt entered holding a tray of dates and tea. I looked at them suspiciously, but I was starving, and I figured if she meant to kill me, I'd be dead. "My parents..." "Your legal guardians will be missed," she said. Why did this happen? There are some things that you are better off not knowing. I suppose the most I can say is that we come from a very old family, maybe the oldest family, one whose roots go back to the dawn of human history. From time to time, a question of succession arises. The rules are rather arcane, but it's not strictly father to son, mother to daughter. More important are the number of surviving cousins, brothers and sisters, that sort of thing. I was trying to take in everything she was saying, but in truth I was nervously glancing around the room. There was no closet here, no protector. I had never felt so alone. My aunt continued, "Often there is bloodshed, sometimes a bloodbath. For years the families lie in wait, knowing the moment of bloodletting will eventually arrive. And then everyone moves at once until things are sorted out. It's the reason we employ certain protectors." My heart was beating fast again. For many years you were seventh in line. Then, for a moment, you were fifth. Then third. Then, well, something terrible happened to several families. And now, here we are, with a new queen already selected and 100 people ahead of you to be next in line after her. Lucky you, I suppose. I couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop shaking. "Where is then Closet?" I asked. "Your protector has been reassigned," she explained. "You don't need him anymore." The years that followed were hard. I went to live with unfamiliar relatives who knew little of my previous life. My new room was smaller, with barely room for a small desk and a dresser. I had no closet. Suddenly, I was middle class, treated like a normal child. My new family had been told that I'd been through some sort of trauma, but struggled to understand why I shied away from windows. When I tried to speak with other children, I came off like an encyclopedia, spouting occasional phrases in dead languages and facts about the emperors of Rome. I aged, growing into a teenager, getting swept up into the world. The adjustment was difficult at first, but also thrilling. I still remember the first day I was allowed to walk on my own to school. I reached a major intersection and didn't even cross when the signal came on. I was so enthralled looking in all four directions, knowing that I could walk any way I chose, off into the seemingly infinite world. By the time I reached college, my early childhood had almost started to feel like a distant dream. I had adapted, or at least learned to put on the facade of a normal person. I hadn't had a boyfriend yet, and my friendships were awkward and surface level, but it seemed I was on track to eventually integrate into the world. One day, my sophomore year, I borrowed a friend's most revealing outfit and walked through the biting cold to a holiday party. The lightly falling snow immediately summoned goosebumps on my bare skin, but I pressed on, eager to be part of the world. At the party, I drank far too much and ended up sharing my first kiss with an older guy, a senior with a bad reputation. I looked for my friends but couldn't find them. The boy kept offering me drinks, and before too long, he was walking me home, his hand already playing with the backstraps of my dress. We practically fell into my place, a little cottage my family had rented near campus. The boy had something upsetting by that point, and I wanted him to go, but he wasn't really listening. "You owe me," he kept saying. "You invited me here. Just a little something. Just a little." I tried to push him away, but he was twice my size. He had me on the floor, wrists pinned. "Huh," he said, suddenly noticing something in the corner of the room. "What's that?" I turned, and there it was, just as I remembered it. The closet. It hadn't been there that morning. Now, suddenly, it was back, just as if it had been there all along. "You should go," I said. I wasn't afraid anymore. Suddenly the boy seemed small. "I don't think so," he said, tightening his grip. "You're hurting me," I said, but I wasn't really talking to him anymore. "Only a little bit," he said, smiling. "Last chance," I said, and he let one of my arms go, but it was only to start unbuckling his belt. I heard the clank of his buckle hitting the floor, then the creak of a closet door. It was the last sound he ever heard. My husband keeps leaving eggshells under our wardrobe. At first I was going to post this in a relationship advice subreddit, but as it started getting stranger, I realized it makes more sense here. So every morning my F-35 husband, M36, would wake up early and cook breakfast for us and our two kids. It was usually eggs and bacon, with some toast or biscuits or pancakes. We recently moved into a new 3-bedroom apartment in a much older part of the city, with this beautiful dark wood furniture already in it. Since it was real wood, the lady renting it out decided it would be too heavy to be worth selling. Well, ever since, my husband seemed to have picked up a strange habit. He's always been a bit lazy with cleaning up after cooking, so I'd always have to take the used eggshells out of the carton and throw them away for him. After we moved into the new place, I was proud of him. There'd never be eggshells in the carton, so I assumed he'd taken the chance amid all the chaos to fix a few of his bad habits. Well, Q1 random Tuesday morning. It was a work holiday at my office, but everyone else was out of the house. I decided to sweep and dust the place thoroughly, which we hadn't done since we'd moved in a month or so prior. I found a lot of dust bunnies and some coins and knickknacks, but by far the strangest thing I found was when I got to the wardrobe in our bedroom. It stood about 4 inches, 10 centimeters I think, off the ground, on hand-carved clawed feet. When I peered under it, there was a lot of dust and spider webs, but behind it were eggshells. Admittedly, I jumped a little when I first saw them, but I pretty quickly realized, well, assumed, they were just regular eggshells, maybe 7 or 8. I swept them out from under the wardrobe and threw them away. I figured they were from the previous owner, though I was thoroughly confused by why they'd be there of all places. I cleaned again the next weekend. This time, I found eggshells under the couch. Pale white, slightly bigger, and slightly slimy. They must have been recent. That, and the fact I'd cleaned under the couch last time, ruled out the previous tenants as a source of the shells. I still wasn't sure if I wanted to bring it up with my husband. It seemed too strange of a thing to do intentionally, so I racked my brain for other explanations. Maybe they got knocked under there unintentionally? But how would that happen half a dozen times? Maybe they got dragged under there by an animal. But we didn't have pets, and thankfully, no issues with rodents or other critters. Maybe one of our kids fished them out of the trash and put them there? But Zoe was too young to get into the trash can. She could barely walk yet. And Nick, well, Nick could have done it. He was 7, but I still couldn't think of a motive. Over the following weeks, this happened several more times. Once it was in a dusty corner of the pantry, but both other times, it was the wardrobe again. I started getting increasingly curious, almost disturbed by the occurrences. It was a part of my morning routine before anyone else got up, to check under every piece of furniture and in the corner of every closet and pantry with a little pen light, to check for shells from the previous morning without being interrupted. It had gotten more frequent. Pretty much every day, I was finding eggshells, almost always under the wardrobe, nestled near the baseboard of the wall, not too far from the radiator. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to just watch my husband as he threw away the eggshells from breakfast, since now that we'd moved across the city, my commute was twice as long and I had to leave before breakfast was ready. He'd still have some toast or oatmeal ready for me though, while I did my hair and makeup. Finally, I decided to just confront him about it, since it was increasingly bothering me. Was this some sort of prank? A strange compulsion? Just his way of getting back at me for always complaining about the eggshells? Surely he knew that I knew, since I'd been cleaning them up every morning from under the wardrobe. When he got home from his job, inspecting shipping crates one day, I gave him some time to relax, then strode into the bedroom with him and shut the door. "We need to talk about the eggshells." He gave a little smile and looked up at me. "So you noticed?" Of course I noticed. I described to him my annoyance and how after the first few times I didn't really find it funny that he left raw eggshells all over the house. In fact, I didn't find it funny the first few times either. I told him to knock it off and stop with the wardrobe thing. "Under the wardrobe?" came his confused reply. I finally took the time to start throwing away my eggshells, since I knew it had always bothered you when I left them in the tray. That's what I was talking about. What on earth are you talking about? I was speechless. So you haven't been leaving eggshells all over the house? Almost every morning I've been finding them. Under the wardrobe mostly. But I've found them in closets, in the pantry, in my bookshelf, in laundry piles. Hell, even under the blankets of our bed. If this is some sort of prank, you've definitely gotten me good. His look of confusion was amplified. Who do you think? Could Nick be doing it? Or is this some sort of prank on me? It can't be Nick. He's too squeamish around raw eggs. I tried testing the waters to see if it was him. He wouldn't even bring me an uncracked egg when I was baking cupcakes. Nick had always been a germaphobe, so his unwillingness to touch raw eggs didn't strike me as an act. Are there any shells under there from this morning? I had never considered checking under the wardrobe in the evening, so I did. I dropped to my knees and peered under it, and nothing. What about the other places? Intrigued, I grabbed my pen light. I'd been finding something every morning for the last week, so if there were any shells, I was sure I'd find them. I checked all the usual places. Nothing. I checked the kids' beds, the kitchen cabinets, under the fridge, still not a sign of eggshells. They must be being moved there overnight, I said, puzzled. I had never connected this to the eggshells, but I started noticing this odd skittering noise in the middle of the night. I would awaken, usually between midnight and 2 a.m., to a strange clicking, like claws on the hardwood floor. It would go away after a second, so I assumed it was the house settling, or maybe a ceiling fan downstairs rattling the floorboards. Rodents had been an early thought of mine, but a call to the previous tenants and a knock at my neighbors' doors confirmed nobody had ever had issues with mice, and we'd never noticed food going missing, holes being gnawed, or droppings. I couldn't understand why mice would move eggshells around, but it was the most likely explanation I had, so I put out some humane cage traps with lures. One night, I woke up and heard the skittering again. This time, I grabbed my pen light and walked out into the kitchen. I shone it around, but the skittering faded off and stopped. On the way back to bed, on a whim, I peered under the wardrobe. At first I thought I saw the shells again, but then I realized I was mistaken. They were uncracked, whole eggs. My curiosity turned to shock, then to revulsion as I realized they weren't ordinary eggs. They were larger, more rounded, slightly moist, and slightly translucent. I could even see darkish blobs floating inside the eggs. It took all of my self-control to not scream in horror, but I jumped and slammed my head into a shelf in the open per usual wardrobe. It woke up my husband, who came to his senses instantly, jumped out of bed, and asked if I was okay. I held on to the part of my head that I'd hit, wincing in pain, but managed to gesture under the wardrobe with the pen light. After looking at my head to make sure it wasn't bleeding, he cautiously peered under the wardrobe with the flashlight. "Oh my God," I heard him say. We whispered for a few minutes, unsure what to do. We couldn't think of any animal that laid eggs like that. We knew we needed to get rid of them, but didn't know where to put them, or how to pick them up. We certainly weren't going to touch them. I shuddered to think of all the times I'd touched those shells with my bare hands, once they'd mostly dried. My skin crawled as I realized whatever was hatching from those had done so possibly hundreds of times under that wardrobe. We settled on using a dinner plate and a spatula to gather up the eggs and walk them downstairs and dump them in the dewy grass. My husband had suggested throwing them off the balcony, but I didn't like the idea of killing whatever was growing in those eggs, despite not knowing what it was. What if they were something cute? They were not something cute. The next night was by far the most horrifying night of my life. I'm going to warn you up front. You might want to just stop here if you've experienced something similar long ago in your life, because you'd rather not know what it actually was. But here goes nothing. I'd felt a bit on edge ever since last night. I'd struggled to sleep at all, so I grabbed an iced coffee from the fridge and pulled an all-nighter writing in my journal about what had been happening and how my life was going. As the sun rose, I started feeling a little silly and figured the eggs were something innocuous, though I still didn't have the slightest clue what. I went to work, albeit with a bad headache, and everything seemed fine. I didn't bring up the eggs with my co-workers, since they would probably think I was crazy or be grossed out and suggest something drastic, like fire. Maybe I should have considered that route. That night I checked the house for eggs, then went to sleep, and was awoken by the usual skittering. This time, though, it was followed up by a muffled metallic clang and much more violent skittering. My heart skipped a beat. The trap must have caught some sort of animal in the house. I considered rousing my husband, but I figured I'd be brave. I took the pen light and peered cautiously around the door. The island counter blocked my view of the trap. As I carefully circumnavigated the counter, I caught a glimpse of the trap and screamed. It held a spider-like, gray, hairy creature, about the size of a rat, or a small dinner plate if you counted its legs. I dropped the light in shock and it broke, engulfing the room in darkness. I heard more skittering behind me and a hiss from the monster in the trap. My eyes were still adjusting to the darkness, but I could see movement out of the corner of my eye. I squared off with one of the creatures, which had its legs bent as if it was about to leap straight at me. Looking around frantically, I realized my only remaining option: up. I grabbed the cord to the attic door and pulled. Something soft and light fell on my head and rolled off my back, but I grabbed the ladder and yanked it down, never taking my eyes off the spider thing, its eyes glowing in the faint moonlight. I scrambled up the ladder to the attic, and the last thing I remember is seeing hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny pinpricks of light, blinking